opening to the 1929 film Chien, Andalou. Its opening scene shocked audiences with its fearless obscenity and consequently led to Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali's entry into the highly exclusive Surrealist group, as they had produced what was claimed to be the first truly surreal film. This video will look at what techniques made Chien undoubtedly surreal, and I find a good way of visualizing what makes something successful is to contrast it with something that wasn't, especially when it comes to a nuanced movement like Surrealism. I'll compare Chien with a film made by, at the time, veteran director Jermaine Dulac called Coquille et le Clergyman, which was unfortunately bitterly hated by the Surrealist group. Now, full disclosure, feminist critics have claimed that this response was simply a misogynistic attack against Dulac, which admittedly may have some weight to it. It was the 1920s after all. Yet I also find this critique somewhat reductive, as I'll go on to identify techniques used in her film that contradict the goals of the movement, and would have been identified by its members as simply not surreal. Now, do I believe that this one group should hold a monopoly on what is and isn't surreal? No, but for argument's sake I'll take their opinions into consideration, as they started what is now known as Surrealism. And it's also what I did for my dissertation, so I'm going to get my money's worth. Link in the description. With all that out of the way, let's begin. Dulac was a respected and gifted filmmaker. She was prolific within the French Impressionist movement, a movement that took pride in being an artistic alternative to mass-consumable American films. Impressionism, like other European alternatives, focuses on the internal, the psychology of its characters, with a heavily aestheticized look, and I believe this is where the problems stem for Dulac. She was deemed by many as almost a natural impressionist. Her goals of filmmaking aligned perfectly with that of Impressionism. Therefore, with almost a decades-long wealth of impressionistic knowledge, she set about making Coquille. But, unfortunately for her, the Surrealists didn't share this appreciation of poetic filmmaking. A key difference between the two films are instantly recognizable. Visually, they are polar opposites. Dulac uses distortive techniques, whereas Buñuel and Dali use unaesthetical, even Hollywoodized mise-en-scene. Dulac even uses more techniques in Coquille than she had in any impressionist film she had previously made. It's almost an overload of her technical prowess. However, the Surrealists were greatly opposed to this aesthetical focus for their movement. Therefore, when they saw the opening of Coquille drowned in these impressionist tropes, they likely instantly identified the film as not following their unaesthetical beliefs. Whereas Chien, although at times does use some artistic techniques, overall presents the film in an unaesthetical way. Camera placement is fairly basic compared to Dulac, and they opted to use pro-filmic techniques, such as these ants. They are real, actually crawling all over the hand. As opposed to being superimposed, it's pro-filmic, it's an effect shot in front of the lens. Now compare these. The first is clearly the result of distortion. The images have no grounding in realism at all. Whereas when Pierre Batchev wipes off his own mouth, it looks real, it is a believable image, and therefore a far more impactful technique in conveying surrealism. And this is key. The Surrealists wanted these strange and controversial or gruesome images on full show, but they also have to be believably uncanny. If the audience doesn't believe the things that they see, it's far less shocking. Leading me to the second section of this video. The Surrealists wanted to portray to their audience images of violence and sex. They loved the work of Freud, and when he wrote about the subconscious ultimately being a combination of repressed, hyper-violent and sexual desires, they loved that too. They also really liked his writings on dream work, especially dreams being the royal road to the unconscious. Still ultimately unprovable, but also not disprovable yet, so it is what it is. The Surrealists saw themselves as liberators of the social consciousness in a religiously repressive 1920s society. They expressly wanted to present their audience with violent and sexual images so that they would identify an enjoyment of seeing these images and realize that they had similar desires repressed within their own subconscious. Moving swiftly on. The way the two films display violence is again vitally important to the mistakes of Coquille and the success of Chien. Surrealism wanted to shock, and which is more shocking, the poetic splitting of a man's head through the use of distortive effects, or the actual slicing of an eyeball? in which the viewer is subjected to grotesque violence in all its glory. Dulac poeticizes and therefore neutralizes the violent potential of Antonin Artaud's script. Surrealist film is one characterized by a violent tone, and therefore shying away from this shows that she did not understand the aims of the movement. Now, it may be simply down to the fact that Buñuel and Dali were more sadistic, but they show their violence, and that is key to what the Surrealists wanted. Finally, another key part of the movement was to recreate the actual mechanisms of dreaming, set out in Freud's interpretation of dreams, as well as temporal disruptions, which I talk about in my dissertation. Spatial disruptions were a huge part of what the Surrealists wanted to convey. In dream work, there is a mechanism called secondary revision. This is, according to Freud, the process of stitching together the unrelated images we see during sleep to resemble some kind of narrative, sort of like an editor stitching together a film. For example, have you ever noticed in your dreams that sometimes you're suddenly in an entirely new location? Most likely not, but now I pointed it out, you might. In dreams, we appear to drift from setting to setting without the longevity of actually travelling. You can suddenly go through a door and be at a beach. Film was an amazing way of depicting this, yet Dulac seemed to have missed this potential. Once again, her stylistic choice stems from her poetic sensibility. She chooses an ornate and pretty transition of images to establish a new scenario, whereas Buñuel and Dali expressly state only to use hard cuts unless otherwise stated. Therefore, Chien more closely resembles the mechanism of secondary revision. They use sudden hard cuts, not giving the audience any time to comprehend the change. We simply accept it, yet in La Coquille, we have moments of reflection in these poetic digressions. It's not sudden, and therefore it doesn't replicate this mechanism of dream work. To make some kind of conclusion to this, it appears the failures of La Coquille et le Clergyman stem from a simple misunderstanding of the aims of Surrealism, as if Dulac believed this Surrealist art boiled down to recreating dreams, and that was it. Her film uses impressionist techniques, however techniques that had also been previously established to indicate a distinction between dreams and reality in film. Her film is aesthetically dreamlike, and that's about it. There is no active measure to recreate the mechanisms of dream work, like there is in Chien and Andalou. Buñuel and Dali somehow naturally understood how they could simulate these mechanisms, which led some to claim the two had an almost instinctive Surrealist sensibility. But yeah, there are other ways in which the two films separate in their Surrealist attempt. I outline further in my dissertation, which you can read and find all the sources I used. Or, who knows, stay tuned for a part 2 at some point. Thanks for watching.